The early morning sun cast long shadows on the quiet city streets as the police car carrying two calm officers came to a slow stop before the grand steps of the white marble courthouse, and she felt the weight of the moment deep in her bones. Inside the high-ceiling courtroom, the Latina chief judge stood behind her dark oak bench with her black robe neatly pressed and her gavel resting quietly nearby on the polished wood surface. Her heart beat steadily in her chest, though she felt a tight knot of worry growing with each passing second as she watched the officers climb out and approach the front doors with serious looks on their faces. The tall windows along the side wall let in beams of golden light that danced across the smooth marble floor and warmed the cool air in the massive room. A single wooden door at the back of the chamber opened with a soft creak when the officers pushed inside carrying a crisp folder full of papers that seemed to tremble slightly in one man's hand. The chief judge's brown eyes widened as she took a careful step forward and adjusted her microphone to speak, but found her voice caught by a sudden wave of surprise. One officer cleared his throat in a steady voice and then said, "Chief Judge Alvarez, you're under arrest by order of the civil court on charges of misusing funds meant for the community center." A deep hush fell over the rows of empty seats where visiting lawyers and staff sometimes sat, and even the faint rustle of papers seemed to stop in the heavy silence. The judge blinked twice and felt her mouth open as though words wanted to come, but could not find a path through her stunned mind. She thought of her late mother who taught her to stand tall and speak the truth no matter how hard the wind blew against her. The officer spoke again in a calm tone that still sounded strange to her ears. "You have the right to remain silent and to speak with your attorney before any questioning." She realized her mind raced with questions about how this had happened and why the officers stood there in uniform with their soft boots on the polished tile. A distant clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence as she watched the officer slide handcuffs from his belt and step toward her with careful resolve. For a split second, she closed her eyes and remembered the day she was sworn in as the first Latina chief judge in the city, feeling pride and hope fill her young heart. When she opened her eyes again, she saw the silver handcuffs glinting in the light as the officer held them open like a pair of cold, unkind smiles. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to stand straight and meet his quiet gaze as he gently but firmly fastened the metal links around her wrists. She thought of the families who counted on her to keep the courts fair and honest, and felt a painful ache when she realized how much they would be disappointed. One of the assistants rushed forward with a small glass of water and placed it on the bench as the judge took a slow sip to calm the sudden fire in her throat. A faint camera flash blinked through the stained glass above the door, where a curious cleaning worker had stopped to look inside at the unusual scene. In the marble foyer beyond the doors, reporters gathered near the grand columns with pens and phones raised ready to catch any word or glimpse of the unfolding event. The judge swallowed hard and began to speak in a voice as steady as she could make it. "Officers, please understand that I've always served this community with the best intentions in my heart." She felt heat rise to her cheeks as she reached out toward them and spoke words she would never have thought she would say in that bright room. "I beg for your forgiveness and for the chance to explain my side before any judgments are cast like stones at my name and my honor." The taller officer paused and let the words settle in the still air, then nodded slowly as if listening to a quiet song that only he could hear. She watched his jaw tighten slightly as he pressed the handcuffs more firmly to ensure they did not slip, but still let her hands rest on the polished desk. Each second felt slow and heavy as she realized how far she had come from her small childhood kitchen to this place under arrest in a place she once called home. Outside the windows, the city bus rumbled past carrying sleepy commuters who had not yet heard the news that would spread fast as wildfire today. She tried to keep her breathing even and lift her chin higher, though the weight of metal on her wrists pulled her shoulders down just a little. In that moment, she wondered if her reputation would crumble like an old stone wall, or if her years of honest service would stand like a sturdy tower in her defense. The smaller officer stepped back and motioned politely for her to follow him as he moved toward the door, leading to the holding room down a silent corridor. She paused for one more glance at the empty courtroom where echoes of her past rulings hung like ghostly memories on the walls of glossy wood. Those quiet walls had listened to her pronounce judgment on many cases, and now they watched silently as she walked away in handcuffs. Each step clicked softly on the marble floor until the echo faded and the doors closed behind her with soft, final thud like the closing of a heavy book. She felt a cold draft from the hallway and shivered as reporters' voices drifted through the crack under the door like whispers of gossip. A single beam of afternoon light followed her down the corridor until it vanished around a corner, leaving her in dull shadow. She thought of her family waiting at home and wondered if they knew yet and if they would believe her side when she had chanced to speak again. The officer guiding her paused at a small bar door and unlocked it with a set of keys that jingled softly in his hand. She turned her head and for a fleeting moment raised her wrists just high enough to see the words that once meant power and now meant restraint. She took a steady breath and whispered, "I promise to tell the whole truth and to make things right if I have made a mistake," and she felt the weight of the moment deep in her bones. The officer nodded once more and led her inside with a firm but gentle grip on her elbow as the heavy door closed behind them with a soft, echoing click. The heavy steel door clanged shut behind her with a sharp echo that bounced along the corridor walls, and the bright courtroom light gave way to dim, buzzing bulbs lining a narrow, silent hallway that smelled faintly of bleach, making her feel small in the vast space. A small worn sign above the door read "Holding Cell 1" in faded black letters that had been scratched by years of damp air and restless prisoners, its worn edges hinting at past struggles. The uniformed officer guided her down the long hall past rows of cold metal bars that led into shadowed rooms filled with echoes of quiet footsteps and muffled voices, creating a maze of light and dark around her. Inside the small cell, she saw a narrow cot pressed against the chipped concrete wall and a tiny barred window high above that let in only a sliver of gray morning light, where silence felt as heavy as the walls. As she lowered herself onto the edge of the cot and felt the rough mattress pressing against her robe, she felt the weight of the moment deep in her bones. The officer slid a battered clipboard across a small metal shelf bolted to the wall and asked her to confirm her name and date of birth in a calm, even tone, each question sounding like a distant echo. She lifted her chin and answered clearly, "Carla Alvarez, March 14th, 1979, her voice ringing softly against the bars. He nodded and wrote her words in neat, precise letters before handing her a thin, scratchy blanket that felt too small for her shoulders, the fabric rough against her skin. When he stepped back, she watched the heavy door close behind him with a slow, final click that echoed through the cell like a closing book, echoing louder than she expected. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders and sat on the cot, staring down at the cold, gray floor as her heart pounded in her ears, as tears threatened to sting her eyes. Her mind raced with images of her family waiting anxiously at home and her childhood home's warm kitchen where her mother's laughter still lingered, imagining their worried faces. A soft drip from a crack in the ceiling echoed somewhere nearby as water slowly fell into a rusted drain on the floor and created a steady, lonely soundtrack, a slow reminder of every stress. She pressed her fingers against the cool metal bars and felt a knot of fear twist in her stomach at the thought of what might come next, and her chest tightened further. Memories of her mother's gentle voice and comforting words filled her mind and softened the sharp edge of her fear, as if her mother's spirit watched over her. She reached into the pocket of her robe and touched the small gold locket she always wore close to her heart, its polished surface cool with memory. Inside the locket was a faded photograph of her mother standing in a garden of bright red roses, smiling under a clear blue sky that seemed a world away, capturing a moment she held dear. She held the locket close and whispered a short prayer for wisdom and courage before the dark, narrow walls around her, asking quietly for help she feared she might not get. Through the bars, she saw the officer's polished shoes disappear around a distant corner before she heard the hallway door lock with a firm snap, the distant lock a harsh farewell. She stood and took one careful step forward, then another, pacing the small space to keep her thoughts from spinning out of control, her feet tracing the same path again and again. In the next cell, a soft murmur rose and fell as another person sang a low tune that floated through the bars like a lonely breeze, the tune echoing against the concrete. She wondered about the person inside that cell and the story that had led them to this place where the walls closed in so tightly, reminding her that lives converged here. When the singing stopped, she heard the faint screech of metal as someone else shuffled keys outside her cell and then passed by without speaking, leaving only silence in its wake. She returned to the cot and brushed a strand of hair from her face, feeling the weight of her responsibilities settle on her shoulders again, grounding her mind in the small space. The single light overhead flickered and hummed in time with her racing thoughts, casting dancing shadows on the cracked concrete floor, the light wobbling like a troubled heartbeat. She glanced at the small clock above the cell door and watched the minute hand move in heavy, deliberate ticks that measured out her confinement, marking each moment with a steady click. Each click of the clock reminded her that time could move on even when hope felt trapped and silent inside these four walls, even when fear felt larger than the cell. She closed her eyes and counted slowly from 1 to 20 before opening them again to steady her breathing and calm her nerves, a simple exercise to hold her calm. Opening her eyes, she noticed a thin crack near the floor where a single green vine had pushed through the wall and grown a few inches across the bare cement, proof that something could break through hardness. She knelt beside the crack and ran her finger along the vine's smooth stem that somehow found a way to survive in the harsh, gray space, a sign that life found its way sometimes. That tiny plant gave her a spark of hope, reminding her that life could break through the hardest obstacles if it tried hard enough, a small victory against the prison walls. She stood again and walked to the bars, pressing her forehead against the cold metal to hold back a new wave of worry, her breath forming a fog against the bars. In the dim hallway outside, she could hear distant voices and the soft hum of a vending machine far down the corridor that sounded like a promise of a snack, a distant promise of normal routines. She tried to imagine the bright cafeteria lights and the smell of fresh coffee from the vending machine as a small comfort to hold on to, a comforting thought in dark surroundings. She straightened her robe and smoothed her hair back, reminding herself that she was still a judge with duties and an honor to defend, as she remembered the sound of her gavel. She called out in a clear voice, "Officer, may I please use the phone to call my attorney before I am moved?" Her tone firm despite her trembling hands. A moment later, she heard jangling keys and felt the door unlock as the officer returned to escort her down the hall, guiding her with steady steps. She stepped out of the cell and felt the chill of the hallway air on her bare arms, making her pull the blanket closer around herself, each footstep counting down her fate. Together they walked to a faded payphone mounted on the wall under a small sign that read "Legal calls only," offering a chance to reach out for help. She lifted the receiver and dialed her attorney's number with calm precision, listening to each ring as her heart slowly began to steady, each ring tightening the knot in her stomach. When her lawyer answered, she spoke in a firm, measured voice. "This is Judge Alvarez. I need you to come immediately to the courthouse to help me explain what has happened," bracing herself for what came next. After hanging up the phone, Judge Alvarez lowered the receiver and took a deep breath. She unwrapped the blanket to free her arms and smoothed the fabric across her shoulders. The officer stood nearby with his arms crossed and waited for her next move. Carla watched him check his watch before nodding to signal they should go. Together they walked down the buzzing hallway toward the main arrest processing room. The walls in the corridor were painted a dull gray color, chipped in many places. She wondered if the building had seen better days before her arrival. When they reached a cluster of desks, another officer directed them to stand in line. Behind the desk, a clerk in a crisp uniform tapped at a computer with quick fingers. Carla recognized the glare of fluorescent lights reflecting off the screen. She took a slow, steady breath as the clerk called out her name. "Step forward, please," the clerk said with clear, firm speech. Carla obeyed and lifted her head high despite her pounding heart. The clerk held up a folder with her name on it in bold type. "Please confirm your address and current contact details," the clerk instructed. Carla spoke each word carefully, making sure it matched her official record. The clerk then asked if she wanted to request bail before the prelim hearing. Carla's attorney stepped forward and turned toward her with a reassuring nod. His calm voice said, "We will argue for reasonable bail given your position." Carla believed in his skill, but felt uncertainty about her future. The clerk printed a small slip of paper and handed it to Carla. "Appear in courtroom 2 at 2:30 for your preliminary hearing," the clerk said. Carla took the slip and glanced down at the printed time and room number. She tucked it into her robe pocket alongside her locket. The officer then guided her through another door into a waiting cell block. Inside, a different holding cell held only 2 other people, their faces hidden in shadow. Carla found a narrow bench along the wall and sat down beside them. One of the detained individuals peeked at her and gave a small nod. Carla returned a nod with a polite smile before turning her gaze forward. She thought of her attorney's advice to remain calm and cooperative. Time passed slowly as she watched the clock on the cell wall tick toward 2 o'clock. The dull hum of a single fan filled the room, stirring dust motes in its breeze. Carla closed her eyes and counted the seconds to keep her mind steady. She thought of the day she first wore her judge's robe, full of pride and hope. Her memories felt like a lifeline in the strange new world of detention. Suddenly, the cell door clicked open, and the officer called her name. Carla stood and smoothed her robe one more time before stepping out. The hallway beyond was brighter and filled with fresh energy. She followed the officer to a wooden door marked with a brass plaque. When the door swung open, she stepped inside and faced the judge assigned to her case. The wooden courtroom door swung open at 2:30 sharp, revealing rows of benches and a high bench for the judge. Carla Alvarez stepped inside wearing her judge's robe, which now felt heavy with worry instead of pride. She took a careful breath and scanned the room filled with people she once led. A bailiff in a crisp uniform nodded to her from the side and motioned her to stand before the judge. At the front, the short judge sat behind a raised desk with a nameplate that read Judge Marshall. The judge's eyes were sharp but calm as he looked down at the papers in front of him. On the left, the prosecutor stood with a folder full of documents that barely fit in his arms. On the right, her attorney stood ready with a notepad and a gentle smile. The room smelled faintly of polished wood and old books on the shelves behind the judge. Carla forced her hands to stop shaking and placed them on the podium in front of her. The judge spoke in a clear voice. "Judge Alvarez, do you understand the charges against you?" "Yes, Your Honor," Carla replied steadily, keeping her eyes on the judge. The prosecutor began to speak. "Your Honor, we ask that bail be set high enough to ensure she does not leave town." He detailed the funds that were missing from the community center account. Carla's heart sank at each word, but she held on to her calm. Her attorney then rose and said, "Judge Alvarez is a lifelong resident with deep roots in our city. She has served honestly for years and will not run from her duties," he added firmly. The judge glanced at the file and frowned slightly at the missing money total. He tapped his gavel lightly on the desk to call for order. "I will consider both sides," he said softly before clearing his throat. Carla looked at her attorney for reassurance and saw his confident nod. She straightened her robe and took a slow breath to steady her voice. The judge reviewed her record and noted her years of fair service, and she felt the weight of the moment deep in her bones. He folded his hands and spoke again in his calm tone. "Bail is set at $100,000, he announced firmly. A gasp rose from the benches as the amount echoed in the room. Carla pressed her lips together and blinked back tears. The judge glanced up and added, "If she can post bail, she may remain free until the next hearing." Carla felt a small spark of hope at the chance to go home. The prosecutor nodded and gathered his papers quickly. Her attorney offered a reassuring look and whispered, "We will do everything we can." The judge stood and called the hearing closed with a firm beat of his gavel. Carla bowed her head respectfully to honor the process. She then left the podium and walked back past the prosecutor's table. The bailiff guided her to a side door where the clerk waited with forms. She signed the bail bond agreement with a steady hand. Outside the courtroom, reporters crowded the hallway and held their phones up. Carla kept her head down and followed her attorney to the exit. They walked past the marble columns into the bright sunlight. She inhaled the fresh air and felt a small sense of relief at the chance to wait outside the cell. Carla hugged her attorney tightly as they stepped out onto the wide sidewalk near the courthouse entrance, where midday traffic buzzed and the glare from tall windows made the polished ground gleam in the sun. Reporters clustered at a respectful distance under the steps, their cameras clicking and their questions floating through the air like eager birds searching for scraps of her story. The heavy bond paperwork crackled softly in her hands as she held it close and felt a flicker of hope rise with each deliberate step toward freedom. On the street corner, a yellow taxi waited with its engine idling, and her attorney opened the door for her with a kind, reassuring smile that warmed her heart. When Carla settled onto the soft leather seat, she gazed out at the busy city scene where delivery trucks and cyclists wove around bright cones and workers fixed the cracked pavement beneath a clear blue sky. The taxi driver glanced in the rearview mirror and nodded as she handed him a neatly folded note with her home address, his calm focus matching the steady breath she tried to keep inside herself. As the car began to move, she watched the courthouse building shrink behind her, its white columns fading like a distant memory she was ready to leave behind. She sighed softly and smoothed her robe at the collar before reaching for a small bottle of water she had brought, twisting the cap off with careful fingers. The cool water slid down her throat and eased the tight knot of nerves as she thought of returning to the place she called home after hours trapped in a cage of metal bars. Her mind wandered to her living room couch where she imagined sinking into its worn cushions with her family gathered around, each face etched with worry and love. Outside the window, familiar shops rolled by, the bakery where she bought warm bread on Sundays, and the florist whose window always bloomed with bright yellow sunflowers. She pressed her forehead gently against the glass and whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude for every small blessing she had once taken for granted. The taxi slowed at an intersection where the crosswalk sign blinked red and white, and she saw children walking to school in crisp uniforms, their backpacks bouncing on their shoulders. She studied their faces and remembered her own school days when her mother walked her to class and held her hand until the teacher called her name. The memory brought a small smile to her lips and softened the lines of worry around her dark brown eyes. The taxi turned down Maple Street, a tree-lined avenue where neighbors waved to her on sunny afternoons, making her feel a fleeting warmth in her chest. When the driver pulled up in front of her modest brick house, Carla caught sight of pale green shutters and a welcome mat that read "Home Sweet Home" in friendly letters. She paid the fare and tipped the driver generously before stepping onto the curb with legs that felt shaky but determined as she took in the sight of her own front door. At the doorstep, her teenage son waited with arms folded and eyes shining with relief, and she opened her arms wide to let him run into her embrace. He pressed his face against her shoulder and whispered, "Mom, we thought they might not let you come back tonight," his voice soft but full of fear. Carla laughed quietly and stroked his hair before hugging him again, feeling the familiar scent of his shampoo and the smoothness of his cheek against her robe. Just behind him, her younger daughter peeked from the hallway and smiled shyly, clutching a small stuffed rabbit she held whenever she felt nervous. The moment wrapped around them like a warm blanket, holding back the chill of the day's harsh events. Carla unlocked the door, and her husband stepped forward with a gentle grin, his suit jacket draped over one arm and a bouquet of white lilies in the other. He placed the flowers in her free hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his eyes reflecting both pride and worry that melted her heart in two. Inside the living room, the soft glow of a lamp and the warm colors of family photos on the wall welcomed her home like a silent choir of love. She set the bond papers on the coffee table and carefully removed her robe, folding it neatly before draping it over a chair. Her husband poured her a glass of orange juice, and her daughter hurried in with a plate of warm cookies that smelled of vanilla and sugar. Carla took a cookie and bit into it slowly, the sweet taste grounding her mind in the present as she breathed in the familiar scent of home. The central clock chimed softly, each bell a reminder that time could move on even after moments that felt frozen in fear. She sank onto the couch between her children, letting their laughter fill the room like bright sunshine chasing away dark clouds. Her attorney called her phone, and she excused herself to answer, stepping into the hallway to hear encouraging news about her case from his calm voice. When she returned, she told her family that bail had been granted, and her next hearing would give her a chance to prove her innocence. Relief shimmered in her husband's eyes as he nodded and squeezed her hand across the table. Carla rinsed her hands at the sink and drew the curtains to soften the bright daylight, letting the room glow with cozy warmth instead. She held her daughter's rabbit in one hand and kissed its soft ears, feeling a tender peace settle in her chest. The phone buzzed again with messages from her colleagues assuring her of their support and trust in her fairness. Carla read each message slowly, letting the kindness of her friends strengthen her resolve to clear her name and seek justice. She returned to her family and said, "Thank you for being here," her voice steady and filled with genuine gratitude. Together they sat in the living room under a soft light, holding on to each other as they prepared for the long road of truth and forgiveness ahead. The next morning dawned with heavy clouds hanging low over the courthouse, casting a gray light over the empty sidewalk where patrol cars idled silently. Carla Alvarez woke in her own bed, the first time she felt its softness in hours, and stared at the ceiling as the chill of fear lingered like a fading echo. She dressed quickly in a simple blouse and black slacks, smoothing each crease with care as she tried to steady her trembling hands before meeting her family in the kitchen. Her husband stood by the stove stirring coffee, the rich aroma filling the air and warming her stomach before breakfast, and he offered her a reassuring nod that eased her tension. Her son and daughter sat at the table eating toast and fruit, their school uniforms crisp and their expressions bright despite the storm brewing in her thoughts. Together they ate in a quiet rhythm, the only sounds the clink of utensils and the soft hum of the coffee maker, as if the world paused to let them find their footing. Carla forced a small smile as she poured herself a cup of coffee, its bitterness matching the taste of uncertainty that settled in her mind. She held the cup close and inhaled slowly before setting it down and pushing away from the table, determined to face her day with courage. Outside her home, traffic flowed steadily along Maple Street, the same cars and buses she saw every morning, reminding her of life's steady march forward. She waved to a neighbor watering her garden, the bright tulips nodding in a breeze as though they offered silent support. Her driver awaited in the driveway, a company car furnished with leather seats and tinted windows to offer privacy during her travel to court. When she reached the courthouse steps again, she paused to catch her breath and touched the smooth stone railing beneath her fingers. The officers at the entrance recognized her and saluted with professional courtesy that stung her heart with shame and respect. Carla nodded back and adjusted her collar before walking through the metal detectors under the watchful eyes of the security guards. She signed in at the front desk and was escorted by her attorney to a reserved conference room, its long oak table polished to a reflective shine. On the table lay stacks of papers with evidence reports, witness statements, and a schedule outlining the day's court proceedings. Carla sat at the head of the table facing her attorney and a paralegal who passed her a folder containing key documents for her defense. She studied each page carefully, her brow furrowing at the thought of how to address each charge laid against her name. Her attorney pointed out passages in the financial statements that suggested clerical errors rather than intentional misuse, giving her a glimmer of hope. Carla leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes for a moment to let her thoughts gather like calm water before the storm. When she opened them again, she laid out questions to ask her team about timelines, account entries, and bank audits to clarify the missing money. The paralegal made notes quickly, typing on her laptop with skilled fingers that danced across the keyboard. Afterwards, they moved to the hallway for a brief break where Carla took a few steps to stretch and breathe in the fresh air wafting through the open windows. She leaned against the wall and watched people pass by, lawyers in suits, clerks with arms full of files, and jurors with curious expressions. For a moment, she felt like one of the many faces in the crowd rather than the chief judge they had once admired. Her attorney placed a gentle hand on her shoulder and said, "We'll get through this. Stay focused on the facts and your reputation will stand." Carla nodded and felt gratitude for the legal ally who believed in her when others might have turned away. Soon the bailiff arrived to escort her back into courtroom 2, where an audience of citizens and media awaited the next phase. The judge's clerk called her name and opened the door wide for her entrance as the crowd murmured and turned their eyes toward the bench. She walked forward with measured steps, raising her head high as she reached the podium and faced the judge and jury. The judge reminded everyone of the charges and asked Carla's attorney to present her opening remarks, and Carla listened closely as the defense outlined their arguments. When it was her turn to speak, she cleared her throat softly and addressed the court with a calm voice. "Your Honor, I intend to show that any discrepancies were the result of a simple misunderstanding, not misconduct." She spoke clearly about her years of service, her commitment to the community, and her willingness to cooperate fully with the investigation. The judge nodded attentively, making notes in a small leather pad as Carla presented each point with careful clarity. After she sat down, Carla's attorney cross-examined the first witness, a finance officer who explained how routine transactions could appear off when a line item code changed. Carla watched the witness testify, noting the faint tremor in his voice that suggested he was uneasy under questioning. Her attorney gently guided the witness through each question with fairness, demonstrating how the funds had been reclassified rather than stolen. When the direct and cross-examinations ended, the judge paused to review the evidence before announcing a short recess. Carla rose and felt a rush of relief mixed with anxiety as she left the courtroom under the watchful eyes of reporters and courtroom staff. In the hallway, she took a deep breath and whispered to herself, "I will clear my name and restore the trust that so many have placed in me," determined to see justice done. As the court returned from recess, Judge Marshall called the proceeding back to order and invited Carla Alvarez's attorney to present the final witness whose evidence would shape the outcome of the case with clear and detailed testimony to ensure that every aspect of the hearing proceeded with the solemn respect and careful attention such a serious matter deserved. The finance officer took the stand again and described step by step how account statements were reviewed and how simple errors in coding led to the misunderstanding rather than deliberate wrongdoing by Judge Alvarez in plain but thorough language, so that every listener could follow each step clearly and without confusion. Carla sat and listened closely while her attorney cross-examined the officer, pointing out inconsistencies in bookkeeping entries that suggested confusion instead of criminal intent in the transactions under question, noting each adjustment with clear labels and precise references to the original budgetary codes for transparency. The prosecutor then presented digital records on a large screen, walking the jury through each transaction and emphasizing the missing funds to support the claim of financial mismanagement, demonstrating how routine software updates could temporarily change numbers without any hint of malice or wrongdoing. Carla's attorney responded by highlighting evidence that showed an assistant clerk had mistakenly entered transactions under an incorrect date, causing an apparent shortfall that had already been corrected in subsequent audits, stressing the speed and accuracy of the corrective audits that restored full balance to the accounts before any harm was done. A forensic accountant was next called forward and explained how complex software updates could shift numbers temporarily, reassuring the court that the fund had not disappeared but were temporarily misclassified. When Carla's attorney questioned the accountant, he confirmed that the corrected entries matched the original budget allocations and that no funds were diverted for personal use, and this reassurance lifted community trust in her leadership now. The jury listened intently as the detailed explanation unfolded, their faces calm but focused on every word that passed between the witness and counsel. Outside the courtroom, reporters gathered details of the testimony, preparing to report on how each piece of evidence might influence public opinion about the judge's reputation. Inside, Carla felt a mixture of anxiety and relief knowing that the truth had begun to emerge from the tangle of numbers and records. The prosecutor then called a character witness, a longtime community leader who spoke about Judge Alvarez's history of honest service and dedication to helping local families. The witness described instances in which the judge had personally intervened to ensure fair treatment for underserved groups, offering those stories as evidence of her integrity. Carla felt moved by the heartfelt testimony and allowed herself a brief glance toward her attorney, whose encouraging nod gave her confidence to continue. The final witness was Carla's former clerk, who admitted to incorrectly inputting figures out of simple human error and expressed deep regret for the confusion caused. That clerk apologized to the court and Judge Alvarez, explaining that no one intended harm and that the mistake was purely accidental in nature and quickly corrected as soon as it was discovered. The judge allowed the clerk's apology to stand and reminded the jury that honest mistakes can happen to even the most diligent public servants. The prosecutor began closing arguments by summarizing the evidence of missing funds, emphasizing the importance of accountability for public office holders. Carla's attorney then delivered his closing remarks, urging the jury to consider the totality of evidence and to recognize that an honest mistake should not be equated with criminal intent. He spoke with clear conviction about Carla's lifelong commitment to justice and fairness, reminding the jury of her contributions to improving access to legal services. As the closing speeches concluded, the judge instructed the jury on how to apply the law to the facts and sent them to a private deliberation room to reach a verdict. Carla took a moment to steady her breathing, folding her hands in her lap as she awaited the jury's decision with quiet determination. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, the jury quietly filed back into the courtroom, their faces reflecting the weight of their responsibility. The jury foreperson stood and announced that they had reached a verdict, and the entire courtroom fell into a heavy silence before those words were spoken. "We find the defendant, Judge Carla Alvarez, not guilty on all counts," the foreperson declared, allowing a wave of relief to wash over Carla and her family. A soft murmur of surprise and relief passed through the audience as people realized that the truth had prevailed in the face of doubt and suspicion. Carla closed her eyes briefly and allowed tears of relief to well up, thankful that her reputation and integrity had been fully restored. Judge Marshall then officially acquitted Carla, stating that the evidence demonstrated an honest accounting error and not malevolent conduct. The bailiff released Carla from the pledge to return, removed the remaining restraints, and gently guided her back to the front of the court. As she walked forward, people in the courtroom stood and applauded quietly, acknowledging her long record of public service and the fairness of the outcome. Reporters hurried to capture her first words in front of the courthouse, eager to record her reaction for their evening broadcasts. Carla took the podium and addressed the press with a calm voice. "I'm deeply grateful for the jury's thoughtful consideration and for the support of my community." She spoke about her commitment to continue serving with honesty and to help ensure that financial systems remain transparent and accountable for all public servants. Families who had long relied on her decisions felt renewed trust in the judicial system as they watched her speak with strength and clarity. The afternoon sun shone through the courthouse windows as Carla stepped outside, surrounded by her attorney, family, and colleagues, all offering congratulations. She paused on the courthouse steps and looked out at the gathered crowd, her heart full of gratitude and determination to rebuild. Her attorney whispered that they had time to return to the office before the evening news, and Carla nodded, ready to embrace the normalcy she had missed. Back in her chambers, Carla signed official clearance forms and met briefly with her staff to thank them for their loyalty and support during the ordeal. She then walked down the hallway and paused a memorial plaque listing past judges, touching her name with a grateful smile etched across her face. That evening, Carla returned home where her family awaited with open arms and a celebratory dinner prepared in her honor, the aroma of her favorite meal filling the air. As she sat at the head of the table, Carla made a silent promise to herself and her loved ones to uphold the highest standards of truth and service for every day that followed. The morning after the verdict, Chief Judge Alvarez returned to her chambers at the courthouse with a renewed sense of purpose shining in her eyes as the bright sun streamed through the tall windows as light filtered softly through the tall pillars. She stepped into the familiar office where polished mahogany shelves held books she once consulted for every decision, and she ran her fingers gently along a leather spine that held her favorite volume of case law with calm determination shaping each thought. Her assistant greeted her with a respectful bow and handed her a stack of files that had piled up during her absence, each labeled with her name in neat handwriting on crisp white stickers as she recalled her mother's proud smile. Carla placed the binder on her desk and took a moment to straighten the framed family photo beside it, where her children smile beneath a banner reading "Welcome Home" while the courthouse clock ticked steadily. The gavel on her desk gleamed under the desk lamp as a quiet reminder of the authority she held and the trust placed in her by the people she served as warm sunlight brushed against her robe. A soft knock sounded on the door, and a clerk stepped in to inform her that she had a full docket of hearings to preside over before lunch, and Carla nodded with steady confidence with a promise of fairness guiding her mind. She donned her robe once more and took a seat behind the bench, her posture straight and her gaze warm as attorneys and litigants settled into the courtroom as a gentle breeze stirred the hallway curtains. The first case before her involved a small dispute over a missing pet, and she guided the parties through a calm discussion until they reached an amicable solution while her heart swelled with gratitude. As each case proceeded smoothly under her leadership, she felt the familiar rhythm of the courtroom return and a deep comfort in her routine as the quiet hum of activity filled the air. After she dismissed the parties with courteous reminder to complete the necessary paperwork, she took a brief moment to glance at the portrait of her late mother on the wall, with her mind focused on truth and honesty. Carla's thoughts traveled back to her mother's gentle lessons about honesty and compassion, reminding her that every person facing the bench carried their own story and struggles as her pen glided across the crisp paper. The courthouse halls buzzed with activity as lawyers hurried between chambers and jurors chatted quietly near the water cooler, all under the watchful eyes of security officers who offered respectful nods with a spark of purpose lighting her eyes. During a brief break, Carla stepped outside onto the courthouse steps and breathed in the fresh air, watching people walk by with confident strides toward appointments and errands as community members waved in support. A few neighbors recognized her and waved with warm smiles, showing that community support had only grown stronger after the trial's outcome, while the busy city streets bustled below. She returned to her office to find a letter from the mayor requesting her guidance on improving local courthouse transparency, a project she had long considered as memories of her mother comforted her. Carla read each sentence carefully, noting the mayor's words of respect for her service and eagerness to involve her expertise in the initiative with the soft glow of her desk lamp nearby. She wrote a quick handwritten reply accepting the invitation and promising to develop a plan for clear financial reporting and public updates while she considered each word carefully. Over the next hour, Carla met with a team of auditors and community representatives in a small conference room, all of whom looked to her for leadership and guidance as hope and duty joined in her heart. Together, they discussed steps to implement easy-to-read budget summaries and public notice boards where anyone could see how funds were allocated and spent with the strength of her family behind her. Carla suggested monthly community meetings in the courthouse lobby where citizens could ask questions and offer feedback directly to court staff, ensuring transparency and trust as reporters prepared to share her story. After the meeting, Carla returned to her chambers with a sense of accomplishment, knowing that her experiences had led to a positive change for everyone as her footsteps echoed softly down the hall. The afternoon brought a final hearing involving a school district budget appeal, which Carla presided over with careful attention to every detail presented by both sides, with her voice steady and clear for all to hear. She listened as school board members described funding needs and community volunteers spoke of programs that supported at-risk students, and she considered each perspective with patience as she pictured her children's proud faces. When both sides finished, Carla spoke in clear terms about a fair solution that balanced needs and resources, earning nods of agreement from the audience while her attorney offered him a reassuring nod. The courtroom erupted in polite applause as she adjourned the session with a firm but kind declaration that justice was served with respect for every person who entered the court. Back in her office, Carla removed her robe and placed it on a hook by the door before pouring herself a glass of water to celebrate a day of successful judgments as she felt the weight of service on her shoulders. Her attorney from the trial stopped by to offer congratulations and to discuss setting up a public interview to share lessons learned and to rebuild public trust while the afternoon light danced across her files. Carla agreed and suggested they record a short message to post on the courthouse website and social media channels to keep her community informed as the words of her oath rang in her memory. As the sun began to set, she gathered her things and prepared to head home once more to her family, grateful for each moment of peace with a deep breath before each important decision. When she stepped outside, she found her children waiting with homemade signs that read "Proud of you" and "Welcome back," their bright faces lighting up the front steps as memories of past rulings guided her judgment. She knelt down to hug them and felt a wave of joy that washed away the last traces of fear from her trial with a quiet smile of confidence and peace. Her son whispered, "We knew you would make things right," and her daughter added, "We missed you every day." reminding her why she fought so hard for truth as her dedication to justice shone through each word. Carla carried their signs inside and placed them on her desk as symbols of love and support that would always guide her decisions while the courthouse doors opened for her return. That evening, the family gathered in the living room to share a quiet meal and to listen to the recorded interview, where Carla spoke about transparency, honesty, and community as the city around her went on with its life. She watched her family's proud smiles as they heard her promise to uphold justice with empathy and to learn from every challenge faced with warmth from the supportive crowd outside. As the clock struck 8, Carla felt a gentle peace settle over her heart and a firm resolve to serve her community with renewed dedication as she held her family's love close in her heart.